On the afternoon before Thanksgiving, 1971, a man in a dark business suit paid cash for a one-way ticket and took a seat in the back of a short flight from Portland to Seattle. He was calm, he was polite. He ordered a drink and he lit a cigarette. And then he handed the flight attendant a note that said he had a bomb. What happened over the next 6 hours has never been explained. He would walk away with $200,000, step off the back stairs of a jet into a freezing storm, and vanish into the dark forever. A note nobody was allowed to keep. $5,800 found by a child on a riverbank 8 years later, and one clip-on tie carrying 100,000 tiny secrets. This is Buried Pages. The afternoon of November 24th, 1971, was gray and wet in Portland, Oregon. At the counter of Northwest Orient Airlines, a man who looked to be in his mid-40s bought a one-way ticket on Flight 305, a short hop north to Seattle. He gave the name Dan Cooper. Remember that name because it is one of the few things about this man we can actually be sure of. He was not, in fact, named D.B. Cooper. That name came later, from a mistake in a newsroom, a wire service mix-up that got printed and repeated and never corrected. To this day, nobody knows who he really was. Even Dan Cooper was almost certainly not his real name. He was a quiet passenger. Dark suit, white shirt, a black clip-on tie held with a mother-of-pearl clip, a raincoat folded over his arm. He looked like a traveling businessman, one of 100 you would forget by morning. Shortly after the plane climbed out of Portland, he passed a folded note to a flight attendant named Florence Schaffner. She assumed it was a lonely man passing her his phone number, and she slipped it into her pocket without reading it. He leaned toward her quietly and said, "You had better look at that note. I have a bomb." The note reportedly read, "I have a bomb in my briefcase. I want you to sit next to me." She sat down. He opened a briefcase on his lap, just enough for her to see inside, a row of red cylinders that looked like sticks of dynamite, a tangle of wire, and a battery. Whether it was ever a real bomb, no one can say. It was never found. But in that moment on that plane, it did not matter whether it was real. It only mattered that they believed it. Then he told her what he wanted: $200,000 in $20 bills, 4 parachutes, 2 main, 2 reserve, and fuel waiting for him in Seattle. He was not shouting, he was not shaking. He gave his demands the way a man reads off a grocery list. And that, more than anything, is what unsettled the crew. He was not desperate, he was organized. While the passengers sat in the cabin, most of them still believing they were simply in a holding pattern, the plane circled Seattle for nearly 2 hours, burning time while the money was gathered. On the ground, the airline made a decision that tells you how seriously they took the threat. They paid every dollar. The Federal Bureau of Investigation photographed the ransom first, all 10,000 bills, recording each serial number onto microfilm. It was a small, clever act of desperation, and one day it would become the only thread anyone ever managed to pull. The money weighed about 20 pounds. It was handed aboard in a canvas bank bag along with the parachutes. And then Dan Cooper did something that surprised everyone. He let the passengers go. All 36 of them, plus 2 of the flight attendants, walked off the plane in Seattle, alive and unharmed. Most of them never knew until they saw the news that they had just been part of the most famous hijacking in American history. He kept only the people he needed: the pilot, the first officer, the flight engineer, and 1 flight attendant named Tina Mucklow, who stayed with him, alone in the back of the plane. Then he gave his next set of instructions, and they were even stranger than the first. Fly to Mexico City. Keep the landing gear down. Keep the wing flaps at 15 degrees. Stay below 10,000 feet. And keep the cabin unpressurized. To a pilot, those instructions mean something specific. That is the flight profile of a man who is planning to open a door in midair. A slow plane. A low plane. A plane you can step out of. Dan Cooper, whoever he was, knew exactly what he was doing. The refueled jet lifted off from Seattle a little after 7:40 in the evening, turned south, and dropped into the night. Behind the cockpit, Cooper sent Tina Mucklow forward to join the crew and told her not to come back. She pulled the curtain. She was the last person to see him. Outside, the weather was brutal, freezing rain. a wind chill far below zero. Beneath the plane, the black, forested mountains of southwest Washington slid past, invisible. At about 8:13, the crew felt it. A bump, a sudden change in pressure, and a slight upward tip of the tail, as though a weight had just left the back of the aircraft. In the cockpit, a small light flickered, warning that the rear stairway, the aft air stair, had been lowered in flight. They called back to him over the intercom. "Is there anything we can do for you?" There was no answer. There would never be an answer. The plane landed in Reno, Nevada, just after 11, with its back stairs still hanging open, scraping the runway. Agents boarded with guns drawn. The cabin was empty. Dan Cooper was gone. He had walked to the back of a moving jet, in a business suit and a pair of loafers, with a bag of money strapped to his body and a parachute on his back, and he had stepped off into the storm. He left almost nothing behind. 2 of the 4 parachutes, one of them a training model sewn shut that could never have opened, 8 cigarette butts in the ashtray, a mother-of-pearl tie clip, and a black clip-on tie, the kind that cannot be pulled off in a struggle or torn away by the wind. That tie is the closest thing we have to his fingerprints. Hold on to it. We are going to come back to it. I want to stop the clock here for a moment, because this is the part of the story that gets under people's skin. Think about what this man did not do. He did not hurt anyone. He did not fire a weapon. He was described over and over by the people he terrified as calm, courteous, even considerate. He thanked the flight attendants. He offered to have meals brought aboard for the crew. And then he committed a crime so complete that, more than 50 years later, the most powerful investigative agency on Earth has never been able to tell us who he was, or whether he lived or died. He did not leave a body. He did not leave a name. He left a tie, some cigarettes, and a question that has been sitting open for half a century. That is why we are still talking about him. Not because he was cruel, but because he beat the system cleanly, and then he disappeared. The Bureau gave the case a name, NORJAK, short for Northwest Hijacking. It would grow into one of the longest, most exhaustive investigations in its history. They had those 10,000 serial numbers. They sent the list to every bank, every casino, every business that would take it, and they waited for the money to surface. It never did. Not a single one of those bills turned up in a store or a bank or a poker room. For a man who had supposedly gotten away with a fortune, Dan Cooper never seemed to spend a dime of it. To some investigators, that silence meant only one thing. It meant he never got the chance. Then in 1972, 5 months after the hijacking, it happened again. A man named Richard McCoy hijacked another Boeing 727, demanded $500,000 and parachuted out the back, exactly the way Cooper had. But McCoy made mistakes. He was caught within days, and for decades afterward, people would wonder, was he the original? The Bureau eventually decided he was not, but his ghost has never quite left the case. And then came the strangest twist of all. It came in 1980 on the bank of the Columbia River. An 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was on a family outing, smoothing out a patch of sand to build a campfire, when his fingers found something buried just beneath the surface. Bundles of paper, rotting, disintegrating, but unmistakable. It was money. 3 packets of $20 bills, about $5,800, decayed almost to pulp, still held together by rubber bands. The FBI checked the serial numbers. They matched. This was Cooper's money. It should have cracked the case wide open. Instead, it deepened the mystery, because that money was found in the wrong place, miles from where the plane was thought to have been when Cooper jumped. How it got there, whether it washed downriver, whether it was carried by a flood, whether it was buried by a survivor, nobody has ever been able to agree. To this day, that riverbank raises more questions than it answers. And it remains the only piece of the $200,000 ever found. So who was he? Over the years, the FBI looked at more than 1,000 suspects. A handful of names have haunted the case ever since, and it is worth sitting with a few of them. Start with the copycat. Richard McCoy was an Army veteran, a helicopter pilot who had flown in Vietnam and an experienced skydiver. Just months after the hijacking, he pulled off an almost identical crime, taking over another jet and parachuting out the back with a fortune. He had the skill. He had the nerve. And decades later, his own children came forward, claiming they had found an old parachute and a logbook on the family property, and that their father had been Cooper all along. The Bureau took that parachute and tested it. But the physical description never quite fit. McCoy was accounted for in ways that complicated the timeline, and to this day, no match has ever been announced. It remains a claim. Then there is the airline insider, a former employee of Northwest Orient itself, a man with parachuting experience who bought a house with cash the year after the hijacking and left behind a small fortune when he died. On his deathbed, he reportedly told his brother there was something he needed to say, but that he could not. He died with it. Yet the FBI said he did not match the description of the man on the plane. And there is the deathbed confession. In 1995, a former convict named Dwayne Weber told his wife in his final hours 4 words, "I am Dan Cooper." He had once shown her a spot near the drop zone, a place, he said, where Cooper had walked out of the woods. But the DNA on the tie did not match him, and his story could never be confirmed. Here is what you need to understand about every one of those names. Not one of them has ever been proven. The FBI never confirmed a single suspect. Every confession, every family theory, every case closed headline you have ever seen remains exactly that, a claim. Which brings us back to the tie. That black clip-on tie is the one thing Cooper left behind that came straight off his body. And decades later, a team of civilian scientists, working with the Bureau's permission, put it under an electron microscope. What they found was astonishing. More than 100,000 microscopic particles clinging to the fabric. Among them, something rare, pure, unalloyed titanium. The kind of metal that in 1971 you would almost only encounter in a handful of places. Aerospace plants, chemical factories, specialized metal shops. It was a stunning clue. It suggested that the man who called himself Dan Cooper might have worked somewhere exotic, somewhere industrial, maybe even in the aircraft industry itself. One researcher pushed that clue even further. Among the 100,000 particles, he focused on a few specks of a rare titanium alloy and traced material like it to a specialized metal plant on the other side of the country near Pittsburgh, arguing that Cooper may have worked there. It is a fascinating trail, but I want to be clear. It is one investigator's theory, not a Bureau finding, and it has never named a man either. Because I have to be honest with you about what that clue is and what it is not. It is a lead. It is not an identity. Those particles narrow the field. They do not name a man. And the small amount of DNA recovered from the tie may not even be Cooper's at all. No suspect has ever been matched to it. Which leaves the last question, the one everyone really wants answered. Did he survive? There are 2 answers, and the evidence supports both. The first says no. He jumped at night into a freezing storm over rugged mountains in a business suit and slip-on shoes with a reserve chute that was sewn shut and useless. The cold alone could have killed him, and the fact that his money never resurfaced suggests he was never alive to spend it. In this version, Dan Cooper died in the trees that night, and the forest simply kept him. The second says yes. The plane he jumped from is famously survivable to parachute out of. Copycats proved it could be done. No body was ever found, no parachute, no wreckage of a failed landing. Nothing. In this version, a careful, competent man planned the perfect crime, executed it, walked out of the woods, and lived the rest of his life as someone else entirely, dying old in his own bed with a secret. The truth is, we do not know. We have never known. And that uncertainty is the whole reason this case refuses to die. So where did he go? In 2016, after 45 years, the FBI officially suspended the investigation. NORJAK is on paper closed. It remains the only unsolved skyjacking in American history. And yet, in a strange way, we all live inside its aftermath. Dan Cooper changed the way the world flies. In the years after he vanished, airlines and the government rushed to close the door he had walked through. Boeing installed a device on the back stairs of the 727, a spring-loaded latch that keeps the aft air stair from being lowered in flight. To this day, engineers call it the Cooper vein. The metal detectors, the screening lines, the scrutiny of a man paying cash for a one-way ticket. So much of the security ritual we now take for granted was built, in part, to make sure that no one could ever do again what one polite stranger did on a rainy night in 1971. But the case itself has never really gone quiet. Amateur sleuths still comb the tie for particles. Families still come forward with old parachutes and older stories. And every few years, a new headline promises that this time, finally, we have him. So far, every one of them has been wrong. Somewhere out there, in a patch of Washington forest, or an unmarked grave, or maybe in an ordinary obituary you have already scrolled past, is the answer to a question a whole country has been asking for more than 50 years. A man boarded a plane with nothing but a briefcase and a lie. He walked off the back of it into the rain, and he took his name with him. Where do you go when you can step out of the sky and leave behind nothing but a tie?